Last week we began a sermon series looking at the first part of Genesis. Basically the first 11 chapters, that's what we're aiming to cover. And we began at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. And I made that point that yes, there are different views about what that happened in those 6 days or the timing of those 6 days, but the key point, the really key point is that God created the heavens and the earth. The whole purpose of Genesis 1 is to glorify God and to move us to awe. And from that we see the high place of humanity in God's creation. That was Genesis 1. This week is penciled in for Genesis chapter 2, and I know Josh is already well advanced in his preparation for next Sunday and Genesis chapter 3. So in light of that, we're going to do the sensible thing. With all this stuff that we could cover in Genesis 2, we're going to look at the first 3 verses and then stop. I'm kidding, of course. The sensible thing would have been to schedule in at least another week before we got to Genesis 3. But it is kind of appropriate because those 3 verses deal with the 7th day of creation, when God rested from all his work, when God stopped. In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, everything there is. And on the 7th day, he rested. Depending on which Bible version you're reading, you might also see that God ceased. God completed the work of creation, then he stopped. The 7th day was the very first Sabbath, because that's what the word Sabbath means, to stop. And yet, before I go on, yes, I know there's a lot more in Genesis chapter 2. Yes, I do intend to come back to it at some point, either after Josh does Genesis 3 or at some later point. If you were here last week, I hope you appreciate I'm not avoiding Adam and Eve, gender and marriage out of a fear of controversy. That's what I was originally planning to talk about, but as I started my preparation this week, I sensed that the Sabbath may be an important topic for us. A lot of us know about it, but how good are we at actually keeping it? So having done days 1 to 6 last week, I want to talk about day 7 today. And let's start by looking at the text. Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. That's verse 1, and it sums up all of Genesis chapter 1. This is the result of God's creation in Genesis chapter 1. And that word thus is a dead giveaway that it links on to what has gone before. I probably should have included these verses in my Bible reading for last week. But it continues in verse 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So what makes this 7th day, this day of rest, this day of stopping, this Sabbath so important? Well, firstly, we see God blessed it. In fact, the Sabbath is the first thing God blesses. Up until this point, creation is very good, but God hasn't expressly blessed anything. This he does. He also makes it holy, which means sacred or set apart. This day has been set apart for God, by God. And we see that reflected in God's commandments. In the 10 Commandments, in fact, this is commandment number 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your town. So even the people around you who wouldn't normally keep the Sabbath would benefit from keeping the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all it is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So clearly, the Sabbath day is vitally important in the Old Testament and vitally important to Israel. Well, what about the New Testament? Now, Jesus seems to take a more relaxed view of the Sabbath, perhaps, at least compared to the Pharisees, you know? They argue about that quite a lot. But does that make Sabbath keeping less of a priority? Not at all. I actually encourage you, go back through the Gospels, find those passages, read them for yourself. But I think what's really going on there is that he cuts through the red tape. He cuts through a lot of the human rules that have grown up around the commandment, and particularly those little words, any work. But Jesus never undermines the importance of keeping the Sabbath. So in all of Scripture, the Sabbath is clearly important. But is it still relevant to us? Why do we need it? Why do we need it? And to answer that, to really understand the importance of rest, I think it's first helpful to understand the importance of work. And some of you may remember that I talked a bit last week about humanity, male and female, is made in the image and likeness of God. And that's Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And part of that image and likeness, I said, is functional. It's actually in terms of what we do. As image bearers of God, humanity was created to represent God in creation, as his regents, as his governors, as his stewards. And we don't represent God by idly sitting on our throne. Instead, we represent God by joining in his creative and life-giving work. Because yes, God rested from the work of creation, but God is still at work in the world. We sang about that in Waymaker. Even when we don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. And we're invited into that. Just as a couple of examples, you could look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. And this is very early in the piece. No shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. Part of the creation of humanity is actually being able to work in creation, working the ground. Again, in verses 19 and 20. Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. Naming something is a creative act. Helping something to grow is life-giving. Joining with God in this type of work is one of the great privileges of being human. And all of it is before the fall. Contrary to what you may be tempted to think, work is good. Work is good, but it is not everything. At some point, work needs to stop. And so God gives us the Sabbath. Because if work becomes our everything, then we start to define ourselves, our identity. We start to define our worth in terms of that work. And that is a very, very common thing in our society. Very common. And not just in our society. If you go all the way back, when God gave Israel that command about keeping his Sabbath, Israel had just come out of slavery in Egypt, where their worth as a people was determined very directly by the number of bricks they produced. If you meet quota, you have worth. If you don't meet quota, worthless and liable to be killed. No breaks, no days off, just work. And incidentally, many people are still in that position. Look up the stats with a group like IJM, International Justice Mission, and you will quickly discover there's more slaves in the world now than ever before. The numbers around modern slavery are truly, truly horrifying. Now, we're lucky we don't have to live like that. But we can still be slaves of a different sort. Slaves not to another person, but to our own concept of work and worth. Whenever our identity is in our work, whenever our sense of worth comes from the value of our work, that's a problem. And it doesn't even need to be paid work. For some people, it's things we do voluntarily. So there's a particular rat race that many of you will recognise, that thing that parents get where they feel that their kids have to have as many opportunities as everyone else's. And we know where that leads. You fill up the week with tutoring and music and dance and sport, you name it. A bewildering and sometimes exhausting merry-go-round of busyness. And those are good things. But if that's your identity, if that's what makes you worthy, it's a problem. And this isn't just a gripe that Sunday sports and shift work mean people don't come to church as much. And that is a thing. But the real problem is that when your identity and sense of worth comes from your work, whatever that is, then that work has become an idol. Your identity and worth are supposed to come from God and your relationship with Him. From God before anything else. So that's one of the reasons we need a Sabbath. By intentionally stepping away from work and that regular busyness of our lives, we do three vitally important things. Number one, we put God first. We say, God, you are more important than anything else I could be doing with this time. Number two, we express our trust in God and our reliance on Him. God, I could have made money taking an extra shift right now, but I trust you will provide. Number three, we express our faith in God's sovereignty. We don't have to strive and produce and control every day because God is always in control and God is always working. Of course, when you are really busy, when you do really need that money, it does feel risky to stop. I understand that, it does. But God is faithful. And there do need to be times when we put Him first. And there's a great freedom that comes when we are able to accept that. Which is good because we also need Sabbaths. What's the other thing that happens when work takes over our lives? We get tired. Really tired. No matter how much you love the work that you do, you will eventually get burnt out and exhausted. God created the Sabbath not just so that we would worship Him, but because we need the Sabbath. We need that rest. What does Jesus say in Mark chapter 2? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. As another writer puts it, we talk about keeping the Sabbath, but really it's the Sabbath that keeps us. Keeps us healthy, keeps us sane, keeps us energized. I would argue very strongly that having a weekly day of rest it's part of good self-care. It's a form of personal maintenance that everyone would benefit from, not just Christians. What does that look like in practice? I think God gives us the pattern here in Genesis chapter 2 for a reason. On the seventh day, God rested. So for us, once every week, every 7 days, we take a day of rest. And the next obvious question is, which day should that be? And it's a valid question. We share the gym here with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, meets here on the Saturday. For them, that is the Sabbath. And they're very particular about keeping it, with good grounds. In Judaism, the Saturday is the Sabbath. Very early in the history of the early church, Christians switched their day of rest and celebration from Saturday to Sunday, the Lord's Day, because that's when Jesus rose from the dead. Which is it? Well, here's where I think Jesus' attitude to the Sabbath is important. Jesus would remind us that the Sabbath is God's gift to us. That's that verse from Mark. The Sabbath is God's gift. It's supposed to be a matter of grace, not a matter of legalism. God doesn't tell us in Genesis which is the seventh day. And if God had anything to do with naming days, He wouldn't have named our days of the week after Norse gods like most of ours actually are. So I don't think it matters so much when you take your Sabbath. What matters is that you keep it. So for myself, this is work time. It probably ought to be part of my Sabbath. Jesus spent a lot of His Sabbaths teaching in the synagogue. And somehow for Him that was Sabbath. For me, look, I rejoice to worship God with you. It is a joy to be here. But in some ways, I'm responsible for this service, and it's very hard to fully relax. So my Sabbath usually runs from about lunchtime on Sunday through to about lunchtime on Monday. I don't always manage it, but I try. And I do actually recommend that whenever you keep your Sabbath, try and make it a full 24 hours if you can. And if you think about why we need the Sabbath, I think that just makes sense. If it's about rest and recuperation, you'll get the biggest benefit by taking the most time in a single undisturbed chunk. If it's about putting God first and saying, God, I trust you with this, well, what does it say if we start cutting corners, clawing back bits around the edges? I just need that half an hour, God, and that half an hour over there, and maybe that hour. So I don't think it matters so much when you take your Sabbath, but I do recommend taking a full 24 hours at a consistent time every week, as much as possible. As much as possible. I know for some people, shift work really rules out the possibility of that weekly pattern of 7 days. For others, there will be other things, but if you can, I think it's really helpful. The other big question, of course, what comes up is what should you do on the Sabbath? What is allowed and what isn't? And it's not necessarily a simple question to answer. I think the starting point has to be what's in the text. In the Bible, God rested from all his work. And in the same way, in Exodus chapter 20, the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. So, again, if you can, stop. Don't do any work. In practice, though, it's rarely that simple. What counts as work? That was the question that had the Pharisees all tied up in knots. And what do you do about emergencies? The best answer I've been able to come up with is this. What should you do on the Sabbath? Less than you are doing, probably, but more than you might think. Less than you are doing, but more than you might think. Let me break that down a bit. First up, less than you are doing. The Sabbath is intended to be a day or time when you stop and rest, and that does mean stopping. It doesn't mean I'm going to put my main job on pause so I can get all the other jobs that I need to do done. I'm not in the office today, so I'm going to get all of the other house jobs done, or whatever that might be for you. And I say that with a grimace, because for me that other work is the study I do towards my master's degree. I have a whole bunch of reading that I need to do for my first assignment, and before I wrote this, I fully intended to go home this afternoon, my Sabbath, and read a few chapters of Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship. And as I wrote this, I realized I probably shouldn't. But here's the curious bit. The reason I shouldn't read Bonhoeffer's book is because for me, it would be work. Were it not for uni, I could read it and keep the Sabbath. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a well-known German theologian from the early 20th century. His writings are really well respected in Christian circles. His book on discipleship is one of his most important works. This is a guy who was serious about following Jesus. I could read it, enjoy it, honor God, and keep the Sabbath, except I would feel like it's work. The freedom to do it, though, that's the second bit. You can do more on the Sabbath than you might think. Again, if you go to the Gospels, see what Jesus did on the Sabbath. He walked around. He approved of his disciples gathering grain and eating. He healed people. And he seems to have spent a lot of time in the synagogue teaching. Jesus fulfilled God's law. He kept the Sabbath. But stopping and resting didn't mean that Jesus was idle. So what's the key? What makes the difference? Remember, God blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. God set apart the Sabbath for himself. Rest is the focus, but you can still do a lot of different stuff as long as it is for the Lord. The key is that the activity is Godwards, to use an expression Josh used a while back. Is what you're doing oriented towards God? Is it drawing you nearer to him? Because the real point of the Sabbath is not just, it's not just rest. It's resting in the Lord. It's abiding in him, to use the language that we have from John's Gospel. The Sabbath is far more than 24 hours of me time. Another way of thinking about it would be to say, does this thing I'm doing express my trust in God and celebrate his goodness? And there's an important passage about the Sabbath in Exodus 31 where God says this to Moses: the Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Israel is not just to observe or keep the Sabbath, they are to celebrate it. For on the seventh day God rested and was refreshed. Now, God wasn't tired. He wasn't worn out from creation, so he needed a rest. Instead, I think that refreshment carries a sense that God delighted in what he had made. Celebration and delight. And that is the Sabbath that we are invited to share. So what should you do, or what can you do? Come to church. Spend time in fellowship with other Christians. Read the Bible. Pray. All of these are good and pleasing to God on the Sabbath. But there's a lot more than that. Take a nap. Give thanks to God that those whose confidence is in the Lord are secure indeed, and go to sleep. Go for a walk. Celebrate all that God has created, even if it's just around your neighborhood. Give thanks for the community in which God has placed you. Maybe take the opportunity to pray for your neighbors. Spend time with your family. Enjoy time with your family. Give thanks for them. Sport. This is a more controversial one, but I think sport is okay if it's approached with gratitude for the physical abilities that God has given us and as a celebration of the bodies and people that God has made. We can do sport as a Sabbath activity if we're doing it with an attitude of thankfulness and celebration of God's creation. Cleaning the house. Those house jobs, well, maybe, I guess, if it's done with thanks for the things God has provided, for the roof over our heads, for the abundance that we have. Maybe it's a chance to imitate God in bringing order and purpose out of chaos. But if it's a chore, stop. You get the idea, I hope. There is greater liberty than you might think, but it depends on our attitude. Are we doing it with a thankful heart, a worshipful heart? If it feels like work, it probably is. And if you safely can, stop. So our passage this morning is very brief. It's really just 2 verses. It's short, but it's one that is still very significant. God worked, and then when his work was completed, he stopped. He rested. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy, and he invites us into that same pattern of work and rest. So it's important that we take our work seriously, firstly. Remember that verse from Colossians chapter 3, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. But in light of this scripture, take your rest seriously. And that doesn't mean get uptight about what's permissible and what's not. What's okay and what's not. It certainly doesn't mean arguing with people who have a different view of keeping the Sabbath than you do. Jesus' example shows us very clearly that the Sabbath is a gift of grace. It should never be an excuse for legalism. So what I mean is the Sabbath is important. More than that, the Sabbath is good for us. Do you have one? Take a chance here. Can I have a show of hands? Who here has a Sabbath that they keep regularly? It doesn't have to be perfect, but a period that they try and take each week. Hands up. That's probably about 10%. Is it a full 24 hours? For those who are keeping it, is it a full 24 hours? probably about half of that. So, yeah, there's space for us to do more here. So what I want to say is, if you don't have a Sabbath, try to book one in. And I don't say that lightly. I've got some idea of how challenging this will be. But get your phone or your diary or whatever you use, work out a time that works for you, and book it in as a recurring appointment. Do it. If you want to, do it now. I won't be upset if you're fiddling on your phones while I finish the last couple of paragraphs of my sermon. Now, I know that will be hard for some people. Maybe your work schedule simply doesn't allow it. Maybe you have non-Christians in your family who won't understand what a Sabbath is or means. You may have to work up to it, if you'll excuse the pun. If your Sabbath keeping will affect other people, talk about it with them. That's the best thing I can suggest. Talk about it with them. Communicate as clearly and graciously as you can. They may not get the whole God side of things, but they can probably accept that a time of rest is good for you. And the other thing I want to say is about doing that will require you to be more intentional about the work you do. Because one of the things I have to be aware of is that my Sabbath keeping actually makes it harder for my wife, who works 4 days a week essentially as a teacher, a 0.8 at a high school, so it covers a lot. It makes it harder for her to keep a Sabbath. If I'm serious about this, then I need to be working on ways that Nick can take a full 24 hours. And that means the time that's not my Sabbath, I need to be doing a better job in the house. And there's probably a whole pile of other things. It will require you to be a bit more organised. And that's not a bad thing, because it's worth having that time. If you do have a Sabbath, for those few of us who put our hands up, think carefully and honestly about how you use that time. About what you do on your Sabbath. Are you getting enough rest? Are the things you're doing leading you Godward or away from God? Are you acting in a spirit of gratitude and celebration, trusting in God and enjoying the Sabbath He has created and blessed? Or are the things you're doing just things you're doing? Me time. I've got a 24-hour break. I'm going to catch up on my sleep. I'm going to watch that show on Netflix that I've been wanting to catch up on. Maybe, I don't know, whatever else it might be for you. And you can still do some of those. There's some shows that don't watch, and there's some books that you shouldn't read, but there's a lot of stuff that you can just do and be grateful to God that He is in control, that you have the free time, and that He has given us as humans a gift of creativity. So you can watch television with a spirit of gratitude and celebration. It is possible. But think it through carefully. Let's see if we can lift those numbers. I'd really like to be able to come back in a week or two and be able to ask that same question about keeping the Sabbath and see more hands go up. So, something to think about. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. He has ordained a Sabbath rest, and it is still good for us to keep it. Thank you.